Welcome everyone to Close Reading Poetry. I'm Adam Walker. In this video, I want to tell you how I compiled the next 4 canons of literature, the method I used, how I ranked the poets, and what I think the value is in these next canons that I'm going to release. As those of you know who have been following my most recent videos on the canon, a literary canon is a standard of judgment. It's a list of works agreed upon by a general consensus of readers and scholars that represents what Matthew Arnold called the best that has been thought or said. These lists were compiled by me to help readers navigate the large body of English language poetry. As Hippocrates said long ago, life is short, art is long. Human life is tragically brief, and the amount of poetry in English accumulates each day. You can't read everything. I can't have read everything, and I never will. But I hope that these canons make the process of reading and choosing what one reads a little less forbidding. We live in an age of access. The internet holds so much poetry that used to only be available behind the monastic walls of universities. But now it's all available, and yet we're reading less widely then, partly because there's more, but also because it's so difficult to navigate all of this literature that's available to us on the internet. So, additionally, I hope that this list may also begin to recover a systematic approach to the study of English literature that existed before the neglect of canons and set curricula within American university English departments. And by reflecting the poets who have been valued by a consensus of readers, critics, scholars, editors, and other poets, these catalogs, these canons I will release, provide a map of discovery for you, for self-learners, public readers, university students, and even university literature educators. My method of compiling these next 4 canons is primarily documentary and boundary set. What I mean by that is the Foundations Canon of 44 poets, which will come out next, the Golden Canon of 88 poets, and the Silver Canon of 144 poets were compiled based on the number of their appearances within 16 anthologies published in the past 4 centuries. I'll talk a little bit about that. But the final list, the Master Canon, is broad. It aims at including anyone who has contributed in some way to English literature, English poetry, and many of the poets within this Master Canon list of over 1,500 poets have never been anthologized, and you will not find them in an anthology. However, you can find them online, and you can learn a little bit more about English poetry and learn about poets who were neglected by traditional canon standards that way. So in that respect, the next 3 canons are going to be boundary set. The Master Canon is going to be a center set, to be inclusive as possible, reflecting an ever-widening canon. So let me tell you about the ranking system involved in the next 3 canons, which you'll be able to find on my website. So I just published a video called the top 6 greatest poets. These are the cornerstone poets. That's the cornerstone canon. Next is the foundational canon. And I've chosen 44, not based on my opinion, but based on the number of appearances of poets within 16 major anthologies and curricula from the past 4 centuries. These are popularly anthologized poets listed based on the number of their appearances within the registers of 16 major anthologies. I aimed at discovering a ranking of poets based on their appearances within these anthologies because these were chosen by scholars, editors, and experts. And although such rankings would vary if a different set of anthologies were used, these anthologies, I believe, reflect the range of literary values that have determined the principles of selection used to compile canons since before the formation of university literature departments in the late 18th, early 19th century. So, to that end, I have selected anthologies from 4 centuries. The earliest anthology on the list is Samuel Johnson's Lives of the English Poets, and the latest on the list is the 2005 Norton Anthology of Poetry. Now, because most of these anthologies were compiled before the formation of a modernist canon, I have lowered the standard of ranking of poets born after 1917. Now, I consulted 2 anthologies of specifically women poets in efforts to balance their exclusion from earlier anthologies. So if a poet has appeared more than once in any of these volumes below, that value is indicated in the final master canon by an X beside their names. Let me show you how that works. Here's a sneak peek at the master canon, which has over 1,500 poets. We're going to be looking at a list. I've just organized the poets based on their year of birth. You'll see Thomas Stanley, Samuel Danforth, George Villiers, John Bunyan. You'll see that John Bunyan appeared in the 16 anthologies that I'm about to show you 4 times. So that places him at a higher ranking. You'll see here, John Dryden appears 9 times. So you know that John Dryden is a very important poet within the canons of English literature. You know Catherine Phillips is important too. She's appeared 5 times. Sir George Etheridge has appeared 2, so maybe not important, but certainly worthy of reading. Thomas Traherne, etc. Charles Sackville, 6th Earl of Dorset. Earl of Rochester appears 5 times in these anthologies. So, although the list of names is ordered chronologically according to year, poets born within the same year are not ordered chronologically according to months. I'll have a note about this once the master canon is released. Now, let me show you which anthologies I used to compile the following canons that will be released. First on the list is Samuel Johnson's The Lives of the English Poets. This is one of the cornerstones of English literary criticism, and it's one of the books that you'll want to read if you're studying literary history of any kind. He's an excellent critic, and in many ways established and put into practice some major important literary practices, including close reading, biographical analysis, and all the rest. These are great essays. These were used as prefaces to an anthology published in the 18th century of what the editors and publishers thought were the major English poets. Many of those poets are not read today or taught today, but some of them are. And so I've included that as an anthology. And again, this was the late 18th century, so this is my starting point. Next, I used Robert Southey's English Poets, Anthology of English Poets. This is the first volume. This is what it looks like. Every poet that was mentioned by Southey makes an appearance as well. And so this represents the values of the early 19th century. I mean, Southey was a Romantic era poet and friend of Coleridge. And so this represents kind of the forming and shaping literary taste of the 19th century, of the early 19th century. The next anthology I used was Arthur Quiller Couch's The Oxford Book of English Verse from 1250 to 1900. This was a staple textbook and anthology for many readers. This was published in 1900. So this was used in the early 20th century, but it reflects the values of the Victorians, the readers of the Matthew Arnold era and the George Saintsbury and all the rest. And what was included here was meant not to reflect merely the literary values of the current age, but poets that Arthur Quiller Couch thought were important. So this was very early 20th century, reflecting the values of the Victorians, and also had an enormous shaping power upon the development of English literature curricula within the university. Next, I want to move into the mid-20th century with this college survey of English literature in 2 volumes. There it is, English Literature in 2 volumes. This was published in the 1940s and was meant to guide English majors through the English canon of literature. This was published in 1946, really near the high watermark of new criticism. The first edition was 1942, so it's right around that period when English literature was really respected and studied. It goes all the way from the Old English era, which is new. You know, the Arthur Quiller Couch's anthology did not go that far, but this was during the time when philology reigned in the English literature department, so people were very interested in Old English, which is great. You used to have to know Old English to become an English major. Now you don't, but it takes us all the way up to the 19th century and comes with introductory and prefatory material written by college professors in the 1940s. So I wanted to include that to reflect the values there. Now this is distinctly American. You might get something different if you took something from Oxford or Cambridge, but this is certainly an important work collection. It's really a curriculum. Next, I have the Stuart Plays. This is an anthology of Stuart drama. So we have poets in here who are not just Shakespeare, but Ben Jonson, all the way up to the Restoration period. We've got Ben Jonson, John Webster, Thomas Middleton, Francis Beaumont, and Fletcher, and James Shirley, among some others. So if you're looking to understand a little bit more about the English stage outside of Shakespeare, this is a good anthology to use. So I wanted a little bit of drama to be represented here in many of these anthologies, both of what I've covered so far in this list and what will come. They have medieval poets, medieval drama, the Everyman plays, York Cycle plays, and also some plays from the modern period. I wanted to include the Stuart plays, which are often neglected. The next is the Norton Anthology of Modern Poetry in 1973. Focus there. There we go. This is a library copy that I found. I find this one very, very interesting. It reflects what critics and editors thought represented modern poetry from their period, which was the 1970s. They actually begin with Walt Whitman, which I think is clever and makes a lot of sense. And they conclude with James Tate, born in 1943. Huge selection of poets that were considered modernists, many whom you would expect, like T.S. Eliot and Hilda Doolittle, many others, Denise Levertov, but also some that you wouldn't expect, some that probably would not have been included in an anthology of modern verse if it were compiled today. The other is this, the Oxford Book of Christian Verse, if I can get that to focus, there we go, edited by Donald Davy, who has a great introduction here. This is a very inclusive book that includes poets not merely on the basis of literary value according to neoclassical or romantic or modern standards, but rather through a representation of the kind of verse that was important during the 17th and 18th centuries. Things like didactic Puritan verse, like Michael Wigglesworth, and some of the hymn writers of the 18th and 19th century. It begins with the Dream of the Rood, so we do begin in the Old English period, and it includes poets all the way up to Geoffrey Hill, Wendell Berry, and Peter Dale. It highlights the fact that this was a kind of poetry that was enjoyed popularly and represents a readership is often on the margins of high literary values like neoclassicism or romanticism. So many great poets in there who are very seldom anthologized wanted to have some representation there. Next, for fun, I did want this to be reflected in our list. This is the bibliography for English undergraduate concentrators at Harvard in 1983, and you all will remember my video on that. Those of you who are friends of the channel, happy to have this in here. So I did. Everything that was included, every poet in here gets ranked in the master list, and many of them appear in the Foundations Canon, the Golden Canon, and the Silver Canon, based on how many times they all appeared in all of these 16 volumes. So we're up to 1983 with this. The next anthology is William Harmon's The Top 500 Poems. I like this book. I think that it's good for public readers who are new to poetry. I think it's a little better than Harold Bloom's The Best Poems of the English Language anthology because his editorial comments are very unobtrusive and they are written to give some context, and they actually come after the poems. So you read the poems, then you can read his little summary at the end. I think this is a great anthology. I have it. My wife has it and grew up on it, and it's published by Columbia University Press in 1992. So this does bring us up to the 1990s. Next is the Oxford Book of English Verse, edited by Christopher Ricks. Now, Helen Gardner has an edition of this. This is the third edition. The first, you'll remember, was Arthur Quiller Couch. Then there was one in the mid-20th century by Helen Gardner. This one's by Christopher Ricks. And I skipped over the Gardner one because I didn't find there was much difference, and if I had to choose two, I would choose the two from either end of the spectrum instead of the middle. And this is just an excellent book. The introduction and the preface, both are just lovely. Christopher Ricks is just a marvelous critic, and he's so fun to read. He clearly loves poetry, and I sometimes teach out of this, so it's heavily annotated, and I also have lecture notes attached to this when I taught this book at the Beacon Hill bookstore when I was doing a lecture series for them. So this is a great companion, and I very much enjoyed it. Of course, it's published by Oxford in 1999, so this brings us right up to the end of the 20th century. Now, there are two books that I do want to mention. The first is Early Modern Women's Writing. So this is from the early modern period, not all poets, but I went through here and I selected all of the poets listed in this anthology because women's writing for a long time wasn't really considered. It was not much valued. Some of the feminist critics of the 1980s did a lot of recovery work in showing that, hey, there's actually a lot of good quality literature here, and it comprises its own genre in many respects, women's writing. And so I did want these two volumes, so this is the first one, I did want these two volumes to represent women's writing. Much of it is fantastic. Here's another one which takes us from the early modernist period to 1778 up to basically the end of the Romantic period. Next, we have our old friend Harold Bloom's The Best Poems of the English Language. Yes, I did include it. I don't hate Bloom. I think this is a great book. I think that obviously it can be a little misleading for people who are first coming to poetry for the first time. I think his critical remarks are somewhat opinionated and unsubstantiated in many respects, but he's an excellent critic. The fact is, he's just an excellent critic. And so if you're going to read this book as somebody who's new to poetry, read the poems first, and then read his prefatory material before each poet, and just take it with a grain of salt. It's good criticism, it's fun to read, but you shouldn't read it as the end-all word. No critic has the final word or judgment on a poem. Just something to keep in mind, but this is great. I know I have some videos in which I do not hold this book in high regard, but I did want it to be included in our list of anthologies, and it does contribute to the rankings. The final book brings us into 2005 with the Norton Anthology of Poetry. It's the 5th edition. This is the one I teach out of as well. I've taught this book at Harvard, and the reason I prefer this over the 6th edition is because it has a great essay in the back on versification and some really great biographical sketches, essays on syntax and form and interpretation. It's just great. It's a great book if you're interested in poetry and wanting to read a lot of it and to have some help with it as you go. So those are the 16 anthologies. They're broad, they span 4 centuries, and I think they represent a good consensus of what poets should be included. So let me tell you about how that works with the canons. The Foundations Canon includes poets who have been listed in these 16 anthologies more than 7 times. And I've included modernist poets who have appeared more than 6, because modernism was very recent. The top 44 poets are the ones who have appeared the most in these 16 anthologies. The next canon is the Golden Canon of 88 poets. This canon includes poets whose names have appeared 5 times or more in any of these 16 anthologies. So this list of 88 poets in the Golden Canon, which will be released soon, represents some of the most important and anthologized poets in the traditions of English language poets since the medieval period. And the Silver Canon is a list of 144 poets. That's basically any poet who has appeared twice or more in any of the 16 anthologies. So this takes the bias that I bring to my critical opinions to the side and allows for more of a consensus of critics from the past 4 centuries, and that's really the aim with this. And then finally, the Master Canon is a list of poets that I have discovered through my own reading, through browsing the old stacks of Child Memorial Library, the English Department Library at Harvard, through my own research of 17th century obscure poets, some Puritans, some hymn writers. It basically includes anyone who's ever written and published poetry in the English language tradition. And so that one actually is not hierarchical, although the ranking system and the numerical value is present beside the names of the poets in the Master Canon, which will be the last canon to be released. So I hope this gives some context for how the canons are put together that are coming out in the next videos, and also some of the values that informed my compilation of these canons. Stay tuned for those, and you can find them on my website in the description below once they are released on YouTube. Thanks everyone for watching, and until next time.